to our second panel of the evening. Thank you. Okay, so it's the same as the last time. We're going to try and ask our panelists to speak for a few minutes on the year has been, and then we're going to go back to them and ask for them for the challenges ahead. And at some point, we may connect with Ohio, tech willing. Lesley.
Right, thanks very much. A bit like Joyce here, actually. It just shows you, Joyce, how often we're usually at the rear end of something or other, rather than the actual full buna itself. I'm conscious that it's a bit boring if we just keep repeating things that have been actually very eloquently said already. So I was trying to take things a bit in a different direction. I was struck by something that Chris said, where he said Scotland doesn't matter, when there was a kind of communal bristle went through the room. I'm sorry, you what? I kind of know what your drift is, but actually the more I thought about it, I just thought, no, actually, I think precisely the opposite has really happened this year in a funny kind of way. And actually, whilst you were quoting marvellously many of the old Scots bards, I was thinking of Hugh McDermott with our multiform, our infinite Scotland, small. And there's been kind of quite a bit of that, really. I mean, I spent, as usual, a bit of this year trotting around Nordic parts with my jaw on the ground. I went for the first time to the Faroe Islands. There are just not enough words to describe how kind of gobsmacking that is. This is a bunch of 49,000 people living on 18 lumps of granite with no fertile capacity whatsoever, who do indeed have the world's most powerfully devolved parliament. Since 1946, when they voted by 50.7% for independence, which kind of scared them as much as it kind of woke up Denmark, who had just watched Iceland waltz off in 1944 when they were occupied by the Germans and not able to do anything about it. Denmark thought, actually, we need to take this seriously, and it gave the Faroes the world's most powerfully devolved parliament. It gave them, for example, legal status, which allowed them to make international agreements. And let's just get this, at that time, this sort of territory constituted probably 40,000 people. Is that even Pennycook? No, it's not. There's hundreds of thousands probably in Pennycook by now. I mean, where is small enough for me to conjure up to give you the Faroes? Wick, right? Wick and Thurso together is the Faroe Islands. And extraordinary. They effortlessly have their own university. They effortlessly teach in their own language, kind of like Danish, but kind of not like Danish, first. They have an expectation of being able to run themselves. They have a thriving independence movement, which might yet vote for those 49,000 people to become independent. And what is their situation? When we're talking about Brexit and all the uncertainties of the world and yada yada, is their situation? Well, the little Faroes is in nothing. It's not in the EU because when Denmark joined in 1973, it used its big joker card to say, actually, see that common fisheries policy? See mince? We're not going near that because 90% of our economy is fish, and that policy is bouf. So the Faroes were able to opt out right there and then, and since then they have been members of nothing. They have not been in the EEA. This is the one that Iceland and Norway are in, because basically Denmark sits in that seat. Just to avoid confusion, the way I think of it now is that the EEA is like a saucer and the EU is like a cup. The EEA is the fundamental single market upon which the policy basket of the EU and its customs union and so on sits. So you can be in the EEA and not have the basket. And there's a lot of people who think that's a pretty good future for Scotland. If you don't have the basket, you don't have the common fisheries policy. It is rubbish. You don't have the common agricultural policy. Currently, it simply fuels the land-based inequities that are bedeviling Scotland. You don't have the customs union, which means that an independent Scotland in the future, let's say, would not have the same massive border problems because of customs with a Brexited England. So there are various things that might make the EEA kind of attractive, and that's the reason Norway and Iceland are members of the EEA, but not the EU. But let's come back to the Faroes. 49,000 people adrift in the North Atlantic who feel the need for nobody, for no support, for no backup, for no big chums. And it is humbling to be in a place like that and suddenly to look back at Scotland as this massive thing, as this dormant thing, as this over-the-horizon bunch of 5 million people who don't know they've got it made, who don't realise the scale of themselves, who don't realise that the North Atlantic is waiting for us, who don't even realise their North Atlanticness, because we're so busy trying to prove we're modern to people who don't give a toss. And that was one heck of a visit, because I looked back at us completely differently, and I've never changed now. It's made me realise as well what a ludicrous nonsense we all knew, but here's the evidence. The ludicrous nonsense we've been palmed off with about ever having something resembling the world's most powerful parliament from Westminster. There's the evidence. In 1946, it was given to a place a quarter of the size of Pennycook. But it's made me rethink as well an awful lot to do with Europe. And I think we need to consider that there are perhaps other clubs within Europe, other solutions within Europe, and maybe not be too wedded to the EU as the only way to express our desire to be full players in a wider field. As a result of going to the Faroes, I met a very interesting Faroese MP, Bjørst Samuelson, who's a woman, by the way, and she was going to a conference which Graham from Lateral North at the back was also at, the Arctic Circle in Reykjavik, to which Nicola Sturgeon also appeared. And she was a keynote speaker. Now, actually, Nicola was billed as a keynote speaker along with Ban Ki-moon. And Graham and I know which one attracted the greater attention, and it was Ban Ki. It is quite an extraordinary phenomenon to see Nicola Sturgeon, and many of you will know that the other part of my year has been spent on land reform, again, with the same banners that we had last year, again, without needing to change a single dot or question mark at the end of anything, because again, we had a tenant farmer evicted for no good reason, because this SNP government doesn't really want to have to take on the legal establishment or the establishment over this. So a lot of my year was spent on a domestic policy basis, basically very, very upset at the notion that there seems to be no way to criticise the SNP constructively because it seems to imperil the independence project. And because politically, apart from Andy and the Greens, there's nobody in there that you feel you want to hand the baton to anyway. I think that's a big problem. There's a kind of domestic, international or national split developing, whereby I think Nicola Sturgeon is doing great guns. She certainly spoke incredibly well in Reykjavik. And it would certainly be said, I think, that she sort of spoke for a very much larger community of we states. She managed to sum up somehow a sort of social democracy, which might actually be there for us to be actively involved with, pulling Europe and the European Union away from the big players and beginning to make them conscious of a different set of dimensions. We've talked about the Russian dimension already with the Baltic states, but there's definitely a North Atlantic dimension which is there to be realised. And it's one that we just need to get our heads around. So I think that's my year has been a combination of some euphoria with some pessimism, really, about what looks like a twin-track government that is conservative, actually, within its domestic policy, and playing sometimes a bit of a blinder on its presentation of Scotland as a distinct social democratic entity within the struggles with Westminster, and the presentation of ourselves to a wider Europe as something of a kind of good player.
Thank you very much, Lesley. I want to introduce David Pratt, and I wanted to say that one of the points of Bella Caledonia and one of the points of this evening is for us to look outwards and for us to be internationalist, and that's why I wanted to speak to Smari earlier, and that's why hopefully we'll connect up with Sarah Kendzior from Ohio in a few moments after David. But I'm delighted David's here because he has been a foreign correspondent for a number of years, and I spent a large part of the last year in the Middle East, so please give a warm welcome for David Pratt. Thank you.
Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good to be here. When Mike actually invited me to participate in this particular panel, one of the sort of caveats to it was that try and remain a little bit upbeat. Well, he came to the wrong man because as everybody knows, certainly in journalistic circles, I've long been dubbed the international man of misery. So, for me, actually, the year has been one of pretty horrendous experiences, it has to be said. And I'd like to reflect on my year, my 2016, in a way by looking at it through people that I've actually met while I've been primarily in the Middle East. For me, it's been a year of unprecedented kind of cruelty. I really feel that cruelty manifests itself quite literally in the Middle East. It manifests itself in many parts of the world. But, I've spent the last sort of 6-7 months particularly focusing in places like Iraq and Syria. And what I see there depresses me hugely. Now, I did warn you that I am the international man of misery, so there's not much upbeat about what I have to say. And perhaps in the second section, when we look forward to 2017, it equally will not be particularly good. I think we've gone through an almost unprecedented period of volatility, violence, displacement, even by Middle Eastern standards. I mean, I'm sure we'd all agree. I mean, every night we're confronted with the images on television of what we've seen in Aleppo. I've also been struck too, I think, given that from a Scottish perspective, that, and indeed a UK perspective, the way in which the Middle East has always resonated. Other parts of the world have always resonated in their own individual lives. But I feel that the Middle East at the moment is resonating in our lives in a way that perhaps it hasn't done for many's a long, long time. It's really bringing the effects of a massive conflict home to us at the moment. And we know that because there are refugees coming here, and Scotland has accommodated many of those refugees to its credit, in numbers, which I think are disproportionate to many other parts of Europe. So that is to be welcomed. As I watch what's been happening in Aleppo, I look forward towards what I think will be a really difficult period now. There's 3 battles that's determining the Middle East right now. We have Aleppo, we have the ongoing battle for the Iraqi second largest city, Mosul, and we have the forthcoming battle of Raqqa. The Middle East, if you think it's racked with turmoil at the moment, watch this space in terms of the next 3 to 6 months. One of the things that frustrates me more than anything about this is the way in which there's been incredible international impetuosity in terms of the diplomatic arrangement. I mean, the UN has not been fit for purpose, frankly, over this. It's shown up the incredible inadequacies of the UN Security Council, which effectively has been held to hostage by Moscow, as indeed it's been held hostage by other members in the past. So we have to look, I think, in terms of other ways in which we can address these crises in the Middle East. We can't be relying on the old, large institutions, or at least we need to put pressure on those institutions in a way that we've probably never done before. The other thing I've noticed about it is the way in which this is reported, something very close to my heart. We were talking about Russia earlier on. There is, I think, throughout 2016, an incredible threat to the way in which the media operates generally. If you look at some of the reports out of Aleppo recently, it's getting very, very difficult now to discern, to differentiate between what is propaganda, and who are the propagandists here. And that in great part is a result of something that really amounts to not having people on the ground and eyewitnesses on the ground. This is a bit of a hobby horse for me. And, and it's reflective of, I think, a crisis in the media generally. We heard about social media at great length earlier on, but we desperately need people on the ground right now independent, impartial reporters who can give us a version and take on events that is as close to the truth as we can possibly get. That is sadly lacking at this particular point in time. So 2016 has been a period of colossal change in that way. It's only just starting. When I left Mosul just a matter of weeks ago, the campaign was almost halfway through, so to speak. They'd entered Mosul. The tough part is yet to come. The post-Mosul environment will be very difficult. This might sound incredibly depressing, but it's a personal view of mine. I believe we're looking at another civil war in Iraq in the new year. I'm convinced that in the post-Mosul liberation period, there will be a showdown between the Kurdish regional government in the north and Baghdad, and that bodes well for the region very, very badly. I mean, really, and for the international community, particularly when we've got a US president about to come in whose view and take on the Middle East is pretty well established. If indeed he tears up the Iran nuclear deal, we're watching really hellish stuff unfold. So 2016 has been, for me, a horrendous time. The people I've met have been inspiring. That's the upbeat side of it. You know, in the midst of all this chaos, horror, violence, volatility, displacement, I constantly meet people that remind me that there is something good there, and that's the basis from which we start. And if I can end just on a note, in terms of a very Scottish note in that way, those people who read my column will know that I'm passionate about the idea of Scotland viewing the world through a Scottish telescope in a way. I'm sick and tired of foreign policy that is actually done through a Westminster take. You know, there's a lot of views on foreign policy issues here in Scotland that we do not agree with the UK government on. Yemen recently is a point in case. And to Angus Robertson's credit recently, he brought that up at PMQs very effectively. We need to really, as a nation here in Scotland, begin to look at how our own foreign policy could be shaped in the future. We've got to start actually laying down the groundwork for that right now. You know, come the next referendum, when we win independence, when we have independence, we need to have these building blocks in place. They cannot be done at the 11th hour. They need to start right now. So we need to, in that great tradition of Scottish internationalism, begin to lay those foundations for a Scotland that looks out to the world and embraces the world at the same time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. And I think one of the things that we need to understand as we evolve and mature as a movement, that the differences between the so-called alternative media and the mainstream media are gradations of grey. They are not black and white. And I think David's presentation and his immense experience on the ground in foreign countries is a resource that we need to draw on, appreciate and applaud. So thank you very much. Having said that Bella wants to look outwards, the other key aspect of Bella's work is to combine politics and culture. And so I'm delighted to introduce Laura Cameron-Lewis. And after Laura, we're hoping to connect with Ohio. So please give a warm welcome to Laura Cameron-Lewis. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. 2016, eh? Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Dear Leonard Cohen, you tell us something that we know about ourselves, but we forget at times of strife and stress. I think artists at these sorts of times have never been more important. As Joyce said earlier, the communal aspect of bringing people together, and not just the artists themselves, but the people who surround the work, using the world to think with. It's the place where we can hold up things that seem mutually exclusive or contradictory, and actually look at what they are. And I think for those of us who've been part of political movements recently, I think that's increasingly more important, that we can find that space to look at the things that we've believed in, the things that we say we're trying to do, and actually understand where the contradictions are and what the impacts of that are. I'm sorry, Mike, I'm doing as artists do. I'm going to break with tradition. I'm going to break with the rules. And I'm actually rolling your two things into one, because I thought about what I was going to give you tonight. And I thought, okay, first, I could just talk to you about all of the intellectual responses I've had to things this year. But you've had a lot of that tonight from really amazing people. So then the other thing I had prepared was the thing that I'd written about motherhood and disability. And actually I've decided to do neither of those things. I was going to give you a vote. I was going to let you put your hand up, and no, I'm not giving you a vote. I'm going to do something of a performance piece. So there's been some mention of the Russian government, and it made me think of, and Adam Curtis's films were mentioned earlier, and those of you that have been following and watching those will have seen the films where he's exposed the work of the performance artist, Vladislav Surkov, in terms of creating a state of disharmony. And now those of us that have lived in an artistic life have for a very long time experienced the sorts of things that young people of today do, which is never expecting to be able to give up work, never expecting to own anything. We're in many ways the canaries in the coal mine. And in terms of the kinds of post-truth narrative that we're in the news and the culture that we're in just now, this is something that's very much been predicted as far back as the 60s and the 70s. And when I was doing my training as an artist, we were very much within a postmodernist tradition and that of a complete distrust with narrative. And so it kills my heart to see that this is where we are all at now. This is where the mainstream is. And I didn't want to be ahead of that bell curve, but that is where we are. And so I want to offer something to you all that's something of a piece of solace for the darkest night of the year. For the evening of eternal dark, Rebecca Solnit's words have been particularly of solace to me at a time where I've been very politically active over the past few years, and at a time where I myself have not been able to read the news without feeling utter dread and powerlessness. I have struggled to find the positivity and the kind of powerfulness that I can have as a human being. And reading Rebecca Solnit's words that she wrote in 2004 made me think of myself in 2003, 2004. I was at the Stop the War protest where I saw for the first time people with buggies and children walking around, and I was like, here we are, political campaigners, protesters, not just young folk in dirty t-shirts shouting slogans, but we're everyone. We're mothers, we're grandmothers, we're disabled people, we're everybody taken to the streets, and yet it didn't make a difference. It didn't make the difference we wanted at that time. 2003, 2004, I was in a performance group called Highway Diner. We made a performance. I stood on stage. This music was playing. This is Godspeed You Black Emperor. The title of this song is Hope. Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark was written in 2003, 2004. I stood on the bricks. I laid a path of bricks. I balanced in high heels, my clothes off. I was naked and vulnerable with the audience. And I said to them, here we are, you and me. I'm looking at you. It's 3 a.m. We've discussed everything there is to discuss, everything we're afraid of, everything we want to build. Here we are, what we're going to do. We've torn the walls down between us. I'm looking at you. You're looking at me. Rebecca Solnit, 2003, Hope in the Dark. She's writing, giving us a text to believe in at the darkest time when George Bush was in charge, the Iraq War was happening. And there I was, 2003, standing on those bricks, looking for hope in a show called Building Skyscrapers, which was about the utter instability and insustainability of the culture we live in, which depends upon people in other parts of the world, their materials, their labor, the riches, the comfort we enjoy, and our utter inability to understand how things could be different. But that is what is facing us now, and what we have to do together. Together, we have to think of a way to do things differently. 2003, 2017, coming up. I turn to Rebecca. She says, grounds for hope. Your opponents would love you to believe that it's hopeless, that you have no power, that there is no reason to act, that you can't win. Hope is a gift you don't have to surrender, a power you don't have to throw away. And through hope, you can be an act of defiance. Defiance isn't enough reason to hope, but there are good reasons. There are good reasons. She wrote this at the height of the Bush administration's powers, the outset of war in Iraq. That moment passed a long time ago, but despair, defeatism, cynicism, the amnesia and assumptions from which they often arise have not dispersed. And even as most wildly, unimaginably magnificent things come to pass, there is a lot of evidence for the defense. Coming back to this text, she thinks about that being an extraordinary time full of vital, transformative moments that she could not have been foreseen. It was also a nightmarish time, and as it is now, full engagement requires the ability to perceive both hope and the nightmare. The 21st century has seen the rise of hideous economic inequality, perhaps due to amnesia on the part of the working people who countenance a decline in wages, working conditions, social services, and the elites who forgot that they conceded to some of these things in the hope of avoiding revolution. The rise of Silicon Valley as a global power center has eliminated and automated countless jobs, enhancing economic inequality, and has produced new elites and monstrous corporations like Amazon, with its attack on publishing, authors, and working conditions, to Google, which is attempting to build a global information monopoly in myriad areas, including the power of the sophisticated profiles of computer users. Hope in the dark. Hope in the dark. It's a tremendous human rights achievement that has been achieved, not only in gaining rights, but in redefining race, gender, sexuality, embodiment, spirituality, and the idea of a good life. The past half century have flowered during a time of dark instability. The stories we tell are the most important thing we have just now. The stories are what have been taking place in the right-wing media, and we've forgotten on the left. The rest of us have forgotten how to tell a compelling story. Changing the story isn't enough in itself, but it's often been foundational to real changes. Making inquiry and an injury visible and public is often the first step in remedying it. Political change often follows culture, and what is long tolerated is seen to be intolerable, or what was overlooked becomes obvious, which means that every conflict is in part a battle over the story we tell, or who tells, and who is heard. I was rather hoping to have ended that performance or action on a more coherent end line. And the music gave up on me there, but we'll stop at that point. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laura.
There may be toys in the background. Sarah, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, well,
yeah,
and we can see you.
All right, I'm trying to block out the view of the rest of the room. Okay. I can see you.
Okay, I'm hunched down here in the corner like some little techno golem. Sarah, you've been very busy writing like some kind of crazy whirling dervish over in the States as the election has gone on, and then it finished. And I suppose one question that we'd all like to hear from you now is, in the aftermath of the election, what's the feelings of the people who oppose Trump over there, and specifically in your part of United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question because people oppose him for so many different reasons. I mean, there are people who have opposed him all along, who opposed him, because of his bigotry, his racism, his hate rhetoric, his incompetence, his lack of knowledge of foreign and domestic affairs. And then there are also people who, were willing to give him a chance, were, even liked him or voted for him, who I think are feeling betrayed by some of the developments that have happened, since he became the president-elect. For example, choosing a cabinet full of DC insiders, billionaires, lobbyists, people who, are in contrast to his declaration to, quote, drain the swamp, or what he did with the carrier plant in Indiana, where he insulted union workers. These actions weren't in line with the kind of populist rhetoric that he was saying during the campaign. So I think that, around where I live in St. Louis and in Missouri, people are wary. He still does have strong support, though, among some, so it's not a universal thing, but overall, I think most people are just very anxious. We haven't had a presidency like this at all. Those of us who are familiar with authoritarian states or kleptocratic states are recognizing patterns in the Trump administration that are very alarming for our country. Other people are worried about their physical safety with a government that doesn't seem to value it for non-white or non-Christian citizens. And there's a lot of factors to consider.
Where do you think the points of resistance are going to emerge in the coming year in 2017?
That's difficult to say too. I mean, I think nationwide, and it's going to vary a lot depending on whether you live in a more conservative state or a more liberal state, whether you live in a city or a town. I think, the best way for people to organize is with their local communities, because, those people, their pre-existing relationships of trust, you know what kind of civic organizations you have, how your government works. That's a strong kind of counterpoint if you disagree with the broader goals of the administration. It's a way to kind of, protect the people in your area. There are also a lot of national movements that are building up, some of which build on pre-existing movements for civil rights or against, government corruption and for more transparency. And, I think all of those have the potential to grow, but the problem is, the Trump campaign has a long documented history of threatening opponents, of, threatening them financially, also threatening their physical safety, of excessive litigation in order to shut people down, of using propaganda to reframe civil rights groups or other groups in a really mendacious way. For example, they started calling protesters economic terrorists, and all of that is a real obstacle to a resistance to the Trump administration forming. That said, I don't think that people who, are committed to democracy and to civil liberties will just roll over, even if, they are being aggressive and trying to prevent protests and dissent. I think people, will continue to do so anyway.
So just one last question. You're a freelance journalist yourself, and I realize that journalism in the States is beating itself up about how it managed to miss Trump. What are the plans of journalists over the next year? What do you hope to do differently?
I'm a real outlier. One, because I did see Trump coming, and part of the reason I saw Trump coming is because I live in Missouri. I live in the center of the country, whereas most journalists live in, California or New York or DC or any sort of elite coastal areas. I think that, people are struggling to figure out what they missed. I think they're struggling with, hatred of the media that's both promoted by the Trump campaign, often with vicious threats that he promotes, but also, honestly kind of deserved in terms of the way that the media exploited the situation and built up Trump. Trump likes to present the media as his enemy, but they've acted as his friend the entire time. And I think now that we're facing the repercussions of that, there's some soul searching going on in the media. And what I would like to see, which is probably unlikely in a dismal economic climate for media, is local outlets built up in places where we haven't really seen them since the recession, like in the Midwest and the South. because I think that would help build relationships of trust between readers and journalists, and that helps with sort of keeping a good dialogue in society in general, and I think could be really helpful as America moves into a difficult time.
Okay, Sarah, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there now. Thanks very much for your time, and best of luck in 2017, and have a Merry Christmas.
You too.
Thanks very much. That's Sarah Kendzior, who writes for The Correspondent, which is a fabulous crowdsourced Dutch magazine, and is the author of The View from Flyover Country. Some of our panel may need to get a train. Some of you may need to get a train. So if people leave the panel unexpectedly, I don't think it's because they've taken a huff. I think it's just they need to get home. Moving on swiftly, we're going to take some questions from you after. Okay. We're going to hear from Gordon, sorry. But I just wanted to remind you that when we do get to questions, we're going to speak to the microphone because we're working with Indie Live, which means that we're speaking to a far wider audience in this room. We're live streaming to across 14 different platforms to thousands of people. So hello to everybody on Facebook Live, and a hello to Cheltenham GCHQ if you're tuning in as well. Gordon is a Bella Caledonia writer, a freelance writer, a tech innovator, and an author of a book that I think you all need to read. Please give a warm welcome to Gordon Guthrie.
I'd like to start by first saying you really need to follow Sarah Kendzior on Twitter. She is absolutely excellent on Trump, and I don't know how she gets through the day. She seems to be working solidly on this and has been for months. Looking back to 2016, I think 2016 and 2017 will be seen as two of the most, I think these are really turning point years we're now in. I think we're seeing globally a crisis of the post-war architecture, the 1945 victors. So this is, in terms of the great cycles of history, the Congress of Vienna, the Congress of Berlin, the League of Nations, and now the United Nations. This is the end of that cycle, I think, that we're seeing. We're seeing in the United States a crisis of confidence. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had this period that led to the invasion of Iraq, of hubris and this sort of monumental Tony Blair's speech about remaking the world. And we're now seeing the downside of that. The Republican Party has effectively collapsed and been taken over by a kleptocrat. I think democracy in the United States, people were talking earlier about the 2020 election. Well, I think there'll be two Trumps on the ticket in the 2020 election. And I think the mechanism that already exists in the United States is going to be used by Trump to gut the Democrat Party. I don't think you're going to see a clean and fair election again. I think the situation is worse than people can imagine. The US has the many elements of the US Constitution that we've known for a very long time don't work. One of the innovations that Putin brought in is this managed democracy, where you have parties that are the opposition parties in Russia are controlled by Putin. He controls both sides of the house. American politics is quite odd in the fact that the political parties are semi-nationalized and have been since 1948. So when they talk about a primary election, the primary election is a selection. In the UK, I, as a member of the SNP, cannot take part in Andy's Green Party selection. In America, Andy would apply to Edinburgh District Council saying, I would like to be the candidate for the Green Party. And the person dealing with this selection in that election could be an elected representative, who could be me. And that has kind of worked in the past. But you have this bizarre situation where you semi-nationalise political parties, and the opportunity to use that to destroy the Democrats. And the way that the Republicans are currently doing in North Carolina. I don't know if people are following the North Carolina state battle. So I think there's real problems with the United States, and the crisis is much deeper than we think. The UK is having a similar crisis. The Brexiteers are split between sort of Farage Trumpists who believe in intrinsic British greatness and the sort of British Reaganites who want to sail off into this Anglosphere. And they're all obsessed with the idea that Britain is still a great power, which was a large part of Tony Blair's obsession with Iraq. That kind of world doesn't exist. I think Trump is burning down the Reaganite settlement completely. I think we're seeing in Russia Russia is by far having actually the least crisis of any of the big powers because it's already collapsed. It's an economy smaller than Italy, as Obama said last week, is a country that produces nothing nobody wants to buy. Its navy, when the navy went round to Syria in a sort of replay of the Russian-Japanese War of 1905, the Russian Navy were tweeting photographs of the American Navy because their own ships were so crap. One of them broke down and had to be towed through the channel. They're currently spending 20% of their GDP on weapons. So the idea that Russia is not Russia, and also they keep their wealth outside the country, right? So if you want to take Putin on, he has billions of dollars stashed away in London and New York. Simply confiscate their money, right? Russia is really not a great country. It's pretty much a joke country. So I think we're seeing this sort of rolling international crisis, and we're kind of caught up in that in a strange sort of way. And I think, I started 2017 writing a book for Bella called War is Coming, and so I kind of got that wrong. The regional wars in the Middle East have not yet emerged, but the potential for them still to do is there. And I think people underestimate the crisis that Trump is going to bring. He's appointed an arch settler who wants to move the American embassy to Jerusalem as an ambassador. I think it's almost certain that the Israelis will take the opportunity to annex Area C, which has long been their goal, and eliminate any sort of Palestinian state. And that's on top of, as David was saying, the Iranian nuclear deal. God save us all. So, so 2016 was a bit of a crap year, really. But I think this is. I don't think if anyone tells you they know what's going to happen in 2017, 2018, I think they're almost certainly lying. I have many strong opinions, but they're strong opinions weakly held. But I don't claim to see any problems with that. But crisis every day, a new crisis, and we still have another week of 2016 left. So I think we should have really scheduled this for the 31st, then we might have the opportunity of nailing the damn thing down. So